Hey, this is Chad Brown with Chad Brown Law. I am actually finishing up a little series I did on the sequential evaluation process, which is the 5-step process that the Social Security Administration goes through to determine if someone is disabled. We've shot a video, an introduction, and all the and each step individually, just to kind of give you a real basic introduction to that. So I thought I'd take a minute and just kind of go through the process as a whole again, and just give you some takeaways and some basic understanding and some nuggets, so to speak, that may help you understand sort of what is and may not be as important with this. So back at my drawing here, if you look at the sequential evaluation process, the first step is substantial gainful activity, or SGA. And at SGA, the main thing I think you need to take away is that generally, if you're working on a full-time basis, you're not going to be able to get disability benefits. Obviously, what is countable income may be lower than what you earn if you have a lot of impairment-related work expenses. But generally, if you're working on a full-time basis at minimum wage or above, you're not going to be able to be eligible in most cases to get disability benefits. And if you're working part-time or working on sort of a seasonal type basis, you have to be real careful about how much you make and whether that's going to qualify you or disqualify you. So if you go to step 2, and you look at, so let's say you're under SGA, and you go to step 2, we're looking at a medically determinable severe impairment. And so I think the big takeaway there is understanding that impairments have to be documented and demonstrated by objective medical evidence from an acceptable medical source. So there has to be some sort of medical evidence to support your case. There has to be an x-ray, there has to be an MRI, there has to be an exam. There has to be some sort of evidence other than you saying you have a problem or you saying that you hurt, which means it's very, very important that you get medical treatment. Now, the rub of that is a lot of times people can't get medical treatment because they don't have medical insurance because they don't have a job, or they can't afford medical treatment or insurance because they don't have a job because they're disabled. That makes it even more important for you, one, to comply and go to consultative exams that the Social Security sends you to. It also means that you need to be able to get into a free or sliding scale clinic so we can get some level of medical treatment. Even if it's going to the ER, you're going to have some medical evidence to support that you're disabled from an acceptable medical source, or you're not going to get through step 2 of the process, regardless of how disabled you may be. Medical evidence is really important in disability cases. And the reason is because you can't get past step 2 without it. If you go to step 3 and look at listings, I think the big takeaway from listings is don't be discouraged if you don't meet a listing. Most people don't meet the listings. The listings are very technical. They look at common medical problems at a unique level of severity. A lot of times, even if you meet the listing, the evidence doesn't clearly support you meet it because you didn't have the right test or it wasn't done by the right person. Obviously, if you can meet a listing, it's really, really valuable for your case because you don't have to look at whether you can work. They make a decision about you being disabled without evaluating whether you can work. But most people aren't going to meet the listings, and you're going to have to go on to step 4 or 5. Step 4 looks at past relevant work, jobs you've done the past 15 years. I think the big takeaway from that is to make sure when you're talking about jobs that you are clear about how long you worked in a job, what your actual job responsibilities were in that job. Because a lot of times what happens is people were actually working in what are called composite jobs, or the jobs had requirements of sort of several different jobs. And in trying to prove you can't do past relevant work, we're trying to eliminate your ability to do certain parts of a job. The more detail we have about a job, the easier it is to show that you couldn't meet some component of the job. So for example, if a job only requires you to do 2 things, it's harder to get you out of that job usually than if a job required you to do 7 or 8 different things. I'm not talking about level of skill or education, just talking about what's required to do the job. So you want to make sure when you're telling the Social Security Administration about your past work that you're including all the details about what you did in that job, because when you get to a hearing, you have to be able to explain why you can't do some of those. The more job responsibilities you have, the more opportunities we have to chip away and say you can't do that, therefore you can't do past relevant work. If you get to step 5, we're looking at other work. Big takeaways there would be you need to understand the medical vocational guidelines, especially if you are 50 or 55. They are there used to be a red book that was produced that talked about the medical vocational guidelines and called them the holy grail of disability. The reason they called them that was because if you can fit nicely in that chart, the government has to pay you your benefits. They have to find you disabled. And so being able, if you're over 50 or 55, to fit within one of the boxes on the grid that shows you're disabled is going to be the easiest way often to get you on disability. Don't be discouraged if you aren't. You just have to be able to prove you can't do other work, which really at that point is about having the skill and understanding to understand why your medical impairments that you're struggling with up at step 2 are keeping you from being the core requirements of most jobs. And so usually what you find at step 5 is you're going to be attacking core requirements that all jobs require. Things like attendance, the ability to stay on task and focus during your job, the ability to stay at the work site, and the ability to interact properly with coworkers and supervisors and the public, if that's what it is. So that's sort of some takeaways from the 5-step sequential evaluation process. If you're going to be on disability, you've got to understand all of these different stages because you're going to have to navigate this process to win. So anyway, it's just an introduction. There's really more to it than that, but I hope that gives you sort of at least a broad overview of what the government's doing when they're trying to decide if you're disabled. Thanks.